I mean, so if it wasn't Lee Harvey Oswald working by himself, what do you think was the motive behind your uncle getting killed?
It was people who were, it was a group from the CIA who were, who had been involved in Miami.
So these people that were involved in the assassination of JFK, of what RFK Jr. is talking about, this group that was called the S Team. And this S Team was put together by the CIA. They were using people down in Miami, you know, the exiles from Cuba, the people who wanted to overthrow Fidel Castro. And it's all connected over to the mafia. And so this huge operation is really huge. That's why they're trying to cover it up. They don't want the CIA files on the JF Kennedy, you know, the full files, the hidden files, and why a lot of files were really destroyed, because inside of the real files is connected to the United States, to the American mafia, from Miami over to Chicago, over to New York. And it has to do with the world drug trade, or world human trafficking that was going through the islands. This is where you have little St. James Island with the Epstein stuff, and then the Virgin Islands, then the Cuban Islands, Jamaica. So that S Team that did the assassination, it was actually put together. It was starting from Nixon. Nixon made a phone call over to Howard Hughes. Howard Hughes had classified clearance with the United States military. He was running operations. Howard Hughes, if you've seen the movie The Aviator, you know, they show him as this guy who only built airplanes, and he was schizophrenia. And the real truth is that he was into really young girls, and he was actually really connected into classified operations that was working with the United States government. And he was doing a lot of classified projects connected to satellites, connected to military planes that was going to start, you know, moving human trafficking operations. That was what was really behind some of these projects that's connected to the CIA with Howard Hughes. Because back then, there were two flight companies that were fighting for control of the air for international travel. That was Pan Am, and then that was also Howard Hughes. Behind Howard Hughes was the CIA operations, was a deep state global operations that was helping funding him through the oil company. And Howard Hughes's father was positioned to sell these bits that they were using for drilling, and he made a tool company that's going to be supplying these certain tools, these drill bits, and they're going to supply it to countries across the world, the United States, Canada, and it's going to be a huge innovational tool that's going to make Howard Hughes's fathers rich. So a lot of these operations, it goes back to the same thing. It's going to go back to elites. It's going to go back to the oil operations, what's really happening, how the CIA with these operations took over, like the Middle East oil trade, how they threw over Iran, how these operations, the CIA is going to take over a bunch of countries. They're going to overthrow countries from Iran to South Korea, all the way down to Middle America, South America. And they're going to have these huge fruit wars. It's going to be the drug trade. It's going to be the oil trade. So that's how Howard Hughes's family comes into this, because they're going to be working with subsidiary companies of the Rockefeller families. So getting back to Nixon makes a phone call in the early 1960s. He makes a phone call over to Howard Hughes, because Howard Hughes is connected. He knows that Howard Hughes knows people inside intelligence agencies. So Howard Hughes ends up calling one of his lawyers. This lawyer's name was Bob Mayhew. And Bob Mayhew contacted the casino mafia over in Las Vegas, and they sent a guy named Johnny Roselli, and Johnny Roselli is the one who made contact to Santo Tropicante. So all of these operations were set up by Nixon to create an assassination team, and he was using Howard Hughes, who was part of intelligence, and then he was also working with the Department of Defense inside operations, and he had classified clearance. So they wanted operations to assassinate Fidel Castro. Now Tropicante, with the CIA that's behind him, these secret operations, they're going to create the S-Team. And this S-Team was supposed to assassinate Fidel Castro. But Fidel Castro had a lot of intelligence behind him from Russia. And then he also had white hats inside of the CIA and the US government that were also giving him information through Russia. So this is a huge story where we're going to talk about JFK and the Russian president. They're going to be behind the back channels talking. They're going to be talking about stopping the nuclear programs, and that's going to be part of why JFK is also going to be assassinated, because it's be connected to trillions of dollars throughout the world that's going to stop the operations of nuclear programs, all the investors, the financial sectors that's connected to creating wars. So Howard Hughes' lawyer, Mayhew, had connections over to the mafia in Las Vegas. And then he had connections that connected over to Tropicante and the crime family. And that family's connected over to the 5 families in New York and then to Chicago. And what Tropicante was doing from Miami was the CIA was working behind him. He was connected to these families of the 5 families from New York. And those 5 families, the mafia, they were actually created by Lucky Luciano. Now, when we talk about Lucky Luciano, if you've been following my podcast and drops, or you know the information, you know that Operation Gladio over in Europe with the Vatican, Knights of Malta, the Jesuits, the Knights of Malta, CIA actually sits on the board. You can still Google that and you can find that. So the CIA that's sitting on the Knights of Malta, they're also with the Jesuits. They decide that they're going to use the CIA and they're going to revive the Italian mafia inside of Italy. So they bring in Lucky Luciano from the United States. The CIA get him into Italy, and he has all the contacts to all the different old Italian families. And inside Operation Gladio, they start reviving all the old rebels inside of Europe. A lot of people who are afraid of, the Russians. They're people that came out from the Iron Curtain. This was after the fall of Germany, and you have all these countries where the Soviet Union took over these countries. So a lot of people of these areas, they had allegiance, their old family ties to these countries. Now Russia took over certain parts of Germany, took over certain parts of East Europe. So a lot of people are angry about that because the Soviet Union took over the countries. Now they're going to have a lot of rebel fighters. They're going to have a lot of people that are still angry about that. Now the CIA is going to use a lot of those old soldiers, and they're going to create Operation Gladio. They're going to say that Russia's going to attack anytime. You need to be sure you have your militia. You need to have rebels. You need to fight for your country, because inside of your country, there's a lot of people who are communist people. There are a lot of people who are associated with Russia. They're spies, they're secret soldiers in your country. Your leaders, people inside the government, are working with Russia. So Operation Gladio was brainwashing a lot of these people to think that Russia was going to attack. There's going to be another invasion. The Soviet Union is coming. It's going to take over. So what they did is these operations of using these ex-soldiers, they went after all of different government officials. They went after legislators. They went after powerful people in different countries, Italy, and they brought the Italian mafia back into power down in Italy. They brought them back into power in separate regions, separate areas, all the way through Italy. Because Operation Gladio, those soldiers threatened a lot of people with guns. People were killed. And after that, people were brought into power. And the CIA, Knights of Malta, they began to take over Italy again. All different regions, controlling all the laws. They started controlling all the resources, the trading routes. Then they also did the same thing in Europe. They started creating a lot of false flag operations, using a lot of people through Operation Gladio, explosions, attacks, killings, and they were blaming Russia. At the same time, they were attacking a lot of people inside of Europe, inside of Germany, inside of France, inside of a lot of places, to where they could sway the elections, where they could control the elites, where they could control the leaders, and they could change the laws. So Operation Gladio, to use Russian propaganda, to use ex-soldiers, to create false flag operations, was actually part of the Vietnam War. I'm telling this story because there are new people to the podcast and they don't know the story of Operation Gladio, of how Vietnam War with the CIA, the Jesuits, they planned the Vietnam War to take over the heroin trade. So the Vietnam War was actually a false flag operation to capture the heroin trade. Now that heroin trade and all the money, it's going to be going over to Hong Kong. Then Hong Kong, they're going to be trading over to the UK, and that money is going to be going over to the Vatican treasury too. So the Vietnam War was about capturing the heroin, the full trade operations. That's also going to create the pharmaceutical industries. So these are huge operations that's connected to Operation Gladio. So that's who Lucky Luciano was. He was sent down to Italy to start operations of gathering all these people inside of Italy together, the families, to bring them together to help Operation Gladio get started. Now that heroin that they're moving over inside of Vietnam, later Lucky Luciano is going to be moving through that. The Vatican's actually moving it. The Knights of Malta, the Jesuits. The Jesuits control a lot of scholars in different countries, and these scholars are like the bankers, executives, a lot of people who went to universities. They became into high positions. They became Freemasons. They became these huge, gigantic leaders inside of their countries for trading, shipping. They're even inside the military in all different countries through the Jesuits. And they create a whole system of where the Jesuits is moving intelligence through the universities, through governments, through law enforcement, through shipping industries. So now they're going to start bringing the drugs from Vietnam. They're going to start bringing it into Italy. Then from Italy, it's going to start trading into Europe. And then from there, it's going to be going through the islands. So Lucky Luciano, the families that he created, the 5 families, they're going to be working with Tropicante down in Florida by the 1960s. So Tropicante, the mafia boss of Florida, he's working with CIA operations and the old operations of Lucky Luciano, and they're bringing in drugs into Havana, and they're bringing it into the Virgin Islands. They're bringing all these different drugs into all these small islands, the Dominican Republic. They're bringing it into Mexico. They're bringing it into Middle America. So these operations are really huge. And JFK was really aware of these operations because his younger brother, RFK Sr., he was actually tied into intelligence. He was getting real briefings from all of these different intelligence agencies that were white hats. They were telling about all of these operations that I was telling you about, of how the CIA, Mossad, MI6, a lot of these operations were running with the Vatican, the Treasury from Switzerland, from Hong Kong, the UK, and how they were creating a whole world drug trade, and how they were using these drug trade also for human trafficking operation, moving European kids, moving European women around to different countries, getting all these girls, these young kids from these different islands, moving them through a drug trade. And they were setting up all these different prostitution rings all through these different islands. That's why these islands are really important, where the Epstein Island is. It's just not one island. There's a lot of these different islands. So JFK was really aware of what was happening. The reason why the Mafia Tropicante is really important is because all of this is going to be captured. Later on, Tropicante is going to talk about this himself, of how he's a part of the people who set up the assassination team of JFK. And as you know now, the CIA was behind Tropicante at the high levels. They had other sources working behind him. The banking systems that was connected, that was behind him. The lawyers that were behind him. So the F. Lee Bailey law firm was actually secretly representing the CIA. And he was actually on the CIA payroll. This is going to be proven later by the people who was actually inside the law firm.
One of the first things we discovered is that our senior partner, F. Lee Bailey, turned out to be on the payroll of the Central Intelligence Agency, that he was in fact on Index 4. There were 4 lawyers that were on retainer to represent any CIA agent who was caught engaged in covert operations inside the United States, which are totally illegal.
Now, after what's going to happen in Watergate in the 1970s, this is 9 years after the assassination of JFK, the law firm of F. Lee Bailey is going to be representing Tropicante. So Tropicante is going to give the whole statement to the people who's working in the law firm, and he's going to tell the whole full story of how he put together the assassination team that was placed by Nixon, by Howard Hughes, to go after Castro. Now that same assassination team that didn't assassinate Castro, they're going to be the same people that's going to be inside of Watergate. They're going to be 3 of the shooters inside of the S team that's going to be part of the Watergate scandal, because that's going to be connected to a cover-up. What happens over in Watergate, the people that were being wiretapped, the leader of the DNC, he directly knew who created the assassination team of Castro and how the S team was used inside the JFK. So the Watergate scandal was actually a cover-up of the JFK assassination team, and this all connects back to F.B. Bailey and their client, which is Tropicante. He knows everything that's going on. He knows that the CIA is using this company of the F.B. Bailey to cover up the CIA operations, and they're going to cover up for him. So this same person, this is a little side note, F.B. Bailey is going to be connected to a lot of very high-profile cases such as O.J. Simpson, because behind O.J. Simpson is the cocaine that's being moved through Buffalo, New York. It's going to be connected to the NFL. It's going to be connected to the CIA running operations. It's going to be connected over to the Las Vegas drug trade. It's connected over to the Los Angeles drug trade. So O.J. Simpson couldn't be found guilty because O.J. Simpson, the people behind him, they didn't want him to be guilty because O.J. Simpson was going to spill the beans. He was going to spill the truth on what was happening with all of these drug trade operations that he was well aware of. Behind the scenes, O.J. Simpson was supplying drugs to the elites inside of the sports industry and then also to celebrities. And he was highly connected. He had handlers that were the CIA. So that's why F. Lee Bailey had to cover up for O.J. Simpson, and they had to throw the case. So that's just a little bit of side note of how this guy is really connected to the CIA. So getting back to the chain of events, the different timelines from the past to the future to the past, it's really important to understand it in this order. So in the 1970s is the Watergate scandal, and the people who break in to the building, they're CIA, but they're also these people that are part of the Tropicante, the S team. They're Cuban exiles, but they're also informants, and they're working with the CIA. So these same people break in to the National DNC committee leader's office, and his name was Larry O'Brien. The reason why they broke into Larry O'Brien's office is because Nixon in the 70s was really, really scared of what was going to come out on him. Nixon was really scared of Larry O'Brien, and that's why they put up wiretaps. They were trying anything that they could find on him, blackmail. They were really scared of Larry O'Brien. The reason why they were scared of Larry O'Brien, who was the leader of the DNC, is because in the 1960s, Larry O'Brien was the chief lobbyist for Howard Hughes. Larry O'Brien knew back in the 1960s, when Nixon was only a vice president, that Nixon is the one who told Howard Hughes to find an assassination team to kill Castro. But that assassination team eventually killed JFK. So that's why the Watergate scandal was really important, because it was going to connect a lot of people. And that's why there was a huge, gigantic cover-up over this Watergate scandal. And the person who represented all those different people inside the Watergate scandal that was connected over to Tropicante, the people who covered that up was F. Lee Bailey Law Firm, a CIA law firm that was protecting CIA operations inside the United States that was illegal. So this huge, gigantic scandal of JFK, of course, it goes back to the CIA, but it's going over to the drug trade because they can't expose what's really happening with Tropicante, because he was the Don, he was the mafia boss over in Havana, over in Cuba. He was the boss over in Miami, and they were also running drugs all the way from China, all the way from Vietnam, all the way from Italy, all the way into these islands. And there was a human trafficking trade that was happening. And RFK knew about this. He was getting the real intelligent briefings, the real intelligent reports that was happening, and he was giving that over to JFK. At the same time, JFK knew about these operations that was happening with the drug trade, with the human trafficking trade, the pedo operations trade, and all of this was connected over to the Vatican, to the Jesuits, the Knights of Malta, the CIA is on their board, and RFK was telling him about these huge, gigantic operations. So JFK was really conflicted about what to do with Cuba, because in Cuba, they knew that the Russians were there, that the Russians were bringing in missiles, and Cuba is just 100 miles away from Florida. At the same time, JFK knew that the CIA really wanted to take 100% control of Cuba to create a new banking system with the globalist elites, and they were going to run a world drug trade system that was there, and it was going to be a new money laundering operation system, and the CIA was going to grow even more powerful than it had become. And JFK was really scared of this because they wanted to overthrow the Cuban government, and the CIA wanted to control all the operations there. So JFK was conflicted between the Russians coming there, and then also if the CIA took over, what would happen. So behind the scenes, JFK was actually in communications with the Russian leader at that time. Nikita Khrushchev was the Russian leader in that time. And Nikita, he knew that Dallas, the CIA, they were moving the drug trade through the whole world, from China with the Vatican, with all of these intelligence agencies, and they were connected to MI6 operations. And he knew that NATO behind it was the full corruption of the deep state. Nikita Khrushchev knew that the Third Reich, the people who created World War I, the people who created World War II, the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, the elite families, that they created NATO. And now NATO's on the doorstep of Russia. And he knows that his old enemies, the Third Reich, they're controlling the United States financial systems, JP Morgan's, they're controlling Wall Street. He knows that they created OSS. He knows that they created the CIA, which came from OSS. He knows that the CIA director, Alan Dulles, wants to come after Russia. They want to come after the minerals. They want to come after the resources. They want to break it into 5 different regions. The reason why Nikita Khrushchev knows about this is because inside the intelligence agencies in the United States, he has a lot of spies. He has a lot of people that are infiltrated. And then not only that, but white hats who want a peaceful outcome to end all the world wars. They also give information to Russia. They work on the back channels. So JFK and Nikita Khrushchev, they were in communications. They were talking. They had spies that were talking in between them to give them the real information. And JFK was well aware that Alan Dulles was coming after him. He knew that Alan Dulles, even though he was removed as the director of the CIA, Alan Dulles was controlling the operation still inside the CIA, and they wanted to create this huge, gigantic money laundering operations inside of Cuba, drug trade, human trafficking, and he was really scared to become more powerful that he can't stop the operations. So talking with Khrushchev, JFK was making plans with Khrushchev that they're going to dismantle all of these nuclear operations. And JFK was already signing executive orders to stop the nuclear programs in the United States. Not only to stop, but to start dismantling these bombs, these nuclear bombs. So when Alan Dulles heard about this, he told the people over in the Vatican, the Jesuits, the Rothschilds, the high powers in the world, the super elites, because these super elites are running the world war operations. They're running all of these warmongering operations, because war creates money, war creates laws, and this nuclear programs, it was connected to trillions of dollars from research to investors to how money laundering operations take place from governments from Germany, from France, from the United States, of how they siphon money from the government into creating these nuclear operations. The whole thing is also a huge money laundering operations, but it's connected over to the Wall Street. It's connected over to banking systems. It's connected to world investors. And everybody was in panic that JFK was going to stop the nuclear war programs and then also end the Vietnam War and all the drug trade that was actually behind it that was coming in, and then the human trafficking that was behind it, and then the full blackmail operations that control the human trafficking operations, the drug trade, and all of these different countries into Asia, Europe. There was a lot of dependency on the money, but also the blackmail operations that secured everything to continue inside of all these countries. So there was a lot of stuff that was riding on these nuclear programs, on these war operations in Vietnam, creating more wars for the future to take over Russia. The real assassination attempt with Lee Harvey Oswald, that was really a setup. Lee Harvey Oswald didn't really want to kill JFK. He only thought it was a false flag operation, that he knew the CIA, he knew that behind the scenes that the CIA, they wanted to create a false flag operation of where they were going to take a shot at JFK. Oswald only thought that he was just going to take a shot and then he was going to get arrested, and then they're going to find out that he was connected to Russia, he was meeting with Russia and Mexico, that he was shooting at these shooting ranges that was connected to Russia, connected to communist parties. That way, when he got arrested, the plan was to say that, you see, the communists, the Russians, have been trying to assassinate JFK. Now we must go after Cuba, that the Russians cannot go there. They wanted to do this full invasion. They wanted to capture Russia. They wanted to start a war against Russia, and they wanted to use Lee Harvey Oswald as a scapegoat, and Lee Harvey Oswald knew about this. So the whole thing was set up when Lee Harvey Oswald was going to take that shot where JFK's car was going to be at. They knew the whole idea, exactly where the car was going to be at, that Lee Harvey Oswald was going to take that shot. So right at that moment when that car was in a certain area where they had marked an X, where they had these training that was going on months before, days before the training. That moment that Lee Harvey Oswald took that shot where the training took place at, right when he took that shot, the S team, they took the same shot exactly at the same time because they all knew where the car was going to be over a certain location. So the moment that Lee Harvey Oswald took that shot, bam, 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 the other people shot in the same seconds within that same moment. They all shot together. And that's why Lee Harvey Oswald was really shocked. Then he understood that he was actually set up and it was a real assassination attempt. But it was only supposed to be a false flag operation of where it would be justified that JFK would have to go after Russia and start a war for an assassination attempt. So there's no way to make this a fast and small story, because this comes all the way from the Khazarians who was over in Ukraine, and how the Khazars came into be Jewish into Judaism, how they converted, and how they moved across Eastern Europe into Western Europe for centuries. By 1550, they came into Spain, and Spain was overcrowded with the Jewish people, the Khazarians. Now, Spain is going to start getting rid of them unless they become Catholic. So there's a huge part of these Khazar Jews, they're going to convert over to being Catholics. Now they're going to have a leader that's going to become the leader of the Jesuits. And then he's going to infiltrate the Vatican. So now you understand how the Khazars, how these Ashkenazi Jews are going to become the Rothschilds. They're going to create all of these different families, how the Rockefellers is connected over to the same people over in southern Germany and all of these elite people, and how they infiltrated the Vatican, how they control the Vatican treasury, how they control the banking systems that was set up in Europe through the Rothschild family, and then JP Morgan, how they got their money, and then the Rockefeller families inside of Europe, and how they're working all together, these elite families. Khrushchev knew about this. JFK was learning about this. And there was huge panic behind the scenes because Russia won the war against Germany. They helped win the war. They're a big factor inside that war. Now the Third Reich, they want revenge, and Khrushchev knows that NASA inside the United States is moving intelligence with the CIA, and they have operations with different missile systems to create war against Russia with NATO. So Khrushchev is really worried about all of these operations, that they're coming after Russia, and that was always the plan. That was always the plan of the Third Reich. That was always the plan of the deep state. That was always the plan of the cabal. So that was always the plan of the CIA. And Khrushchev was really aware of all the weapons that they were moving through NATO all the way along the Russian borders. And that's why Khrushchev went to Cuba, was a large part of that reason, to give a huge, gigantic warning. And that's why JFK was conflicted in between everything that he knew about the deep state inside his country. At the same time, Russia was moving weapons over this way. In the end, he agreed with Russia. Let's dismantle the nuclear weapons. So a huge, gigantic panic came into play. A lot of stuff was happening when JFK was assassinated. There was a lot of things that were going to be investigated as he was the president of the United States, as his younger brother RFK was going to start moving a lot of intelligence, start moving a lot of indictments, and that's why they were both taken out, because they knew about all the operations of the mob. They knew about all the ties that was connected over to Chicago crime family that was moving weapons over to Miami, how the CIA was working with operations over in Miami, the Tropicante drug operations, and then how Tropicante was the mob boss over in Havana, and how they were moving drugs with CIA operations through Vatican, Knights of Malta, from China, the drug trade, moving the huge, gigantic heroin trade, human trafficking operations that began over in the Virgin Islands and all of these different areas over in the Caribbeans. So RFK was really conflicted, and that's why he wanted to end this, because he knew the real story of who wanted to create war with Russia. He knew the real story of what was happening. That's why he stopped the Bay of Pigs invasion. When he stopped that invasion, then a lot of people inside the military who didn't understand all of these operations that we're talking about, that only a few people know about from the Vietnam War, who really created it and all of this stuff, they thought that JFK betrayed, the United States for stopping the Bay of Pigs invasion, and then for not sending, the military planes for the second strike. So the CIA thought it was okay, it was time to assassinate him, because JFK is treason. He's going against his own country, and he's talking with Khrushchev, the enemy of the United States. So all of these operations were okayed by the Vatican, the Knights of Malta, the Jesuits that controls intelligence societies. That information was given over to George Bush Sr. Then he gave that over to Alan Dulles, who gave the okay. Alan Dulles was running all the operations behind the scenes, but he was getting the okay from the Vatican, and the Vatican is getting the information also from Mossad. They're getting it from Israel, because inside of Israel are the globalist operations too. So you have Mossad, MI6, the Vatican, Rothschilds, Rockefeller families, the CIA operations, the richest globalist families in the world that are working together. The okay to kill JFK came from all of these operations of the deep state, the cabal, because they were afraid that he was going to stop all of the wars, and then he was going to go after indictments, and he was going to go after the storm operations. This is where the storm operations originate from, because RFK was telling his brother, we need to initiate storm operations and bring down everybody inside the United States. We need to dismantle the CIA operations. After the assassination of JFK, the special forces that he created, the military generals, the colonels, the admirals that were behind him, they stayed in the back channels over with Russia, with the white hats inside the military there, and they created an alliance. And this alliance connects over into Europe. It connects over into India, Malaysia. This alliance knows about all the deep state operations of who's actually controlling the CIA, Mossad, MI6, the globalist operations connected over to the Vatican. Now these operations to bring down the deep state is happening, and that's known as the storm, the world storm operations, and that's what Trump is heading. But behind Trump is the alliance. That's the ghost of JFK and the operations that he was heading to destroy the CIA and to splinter them into 1,000 pieces.